Hello everyone, I'm Forrest McFreelava, and this is a special recap episode of Speedplay Horselords. As you may remember, we've started off as a very small and relatively weak nomadic entity off at the very edge of the known world. And after several short 100 years of conquest, trials, and tribulations, we've come to be the only independent state left in the entire world. But much more than that. Our religion is the only religion left in the entire world. And even more than that, our culture is the only culture left in the entire world. Our way of life, our government type, nomadic, is the only form recognized in the entire known world. Civilization, cities, have taken a different form. Cities no longer exist. The entire world, from Constantinople to the smallest village, has been turned into pasture land. Places like London, like Paris, Rome, every city you can think of, everywhere in the entire known world, Baghdad, Jerusalem, they have been turned into pasture land. To use an ancient quote in a very different context, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." That quote is typically used to describe the fleeting nature of man's achievements. It's generally thought that Ozymandias was some great emperor whose city rose from the dirts. He made a massive monument to himself, and inevitably it all turned into sands and nothingness. Perhaps we don't give Ozymandias the credit he deserves. Perhaps he didn't create any giant city. Perhaps his legacy was turning it into that desert. To turn what once was a massive empire into those lone and level sands stretching far away. And takes it into a very different context, one that it's rather difficult for us to imagine, as we really do come from settled societies, a background our civilization is based in it. We like to think that our civilization, 1,000 years past this point, represents some great pinnacle of civilization, and that its decline, the destruction of these cities, is just that, decline. That it's civilization going backwards. It's a lower level. However, if we were to take this civilization forward to the year 2015, would they view it that way? Would these people who didn't grow up with nomadic or with settled societies and its cities, its technological growth, would they view it as a decline? I mean, we have every technology that you can reach by 1453 already in 1058. It just takes a different form, a different direction. We have some very, very nice and upgraded tents. Would they see their very nice and upgraded tents as worse than our suburban homes? To quote Colin Wells about the fall of London, or London after the fall of Rome, I should say, quote, "After rapid growth in the later part of the 1st century, London emerged as the stunning center of the Roman Empire on its northern edge, with a monumental architecture, a thriving commercial center, and a military base characteristic of the greatest of Roman cities. The 3rd or 4th centuries in London are marked by a stoppage in major public architecture and a reverse of that process, the dismantling of major stone monuments, and at the same time that much of the formerly urban area seems to have reverted to a non-urban character. To call these changes decline, collapse, or abandonment, as has been done in the past, is to adopt a conservative Roman attitude towards change. Because we live in societies that use monumental stone architecture in ways similar to how Rome used it, we tend to think of dismantling such structures, our monuments to military and civic glory, as distasteful. But the question we need to ask is, how can we understand these changes in terms of the lives and actions of the inhabitants of that specific place? All of these changes, the dismantling of stone buildings, the reuse of the stone, the buildup of dark earth, can be understood in terms of new uses of the formerly urban landscape for different purposes. As evidence accumulates in London, it is becoming clear that the site was not abandoned, as earlier researchers have thought. Life went on in place throughout the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. It was just different. Life goes on in our empire. The pasture land, which once held all of the different religions and cultures of Europe, India, North Africa, the entire known world according to this game, is now admittedly smaller. There are now 5,089,585 people in the entire known world. A marked decline, if nothing else. However, is that necessarily worse? Would it necessarily be better if that didn't occur? We really do tend to think of the destruction of the past as something terrible. There are a few examples of this. One being, there is an artist, Ai Weiwei, who is a Chinese activist and artist, and one of his pieces, he takes an ancient pottery piece, several thousand years old. It's ancient Chinese from one of the very old dynasties of theirs, and on camera in full HD, he drops it, and it shatters. People had been tending to that pot for thousands of years, keeping it safe and preserving it, and in one moment, he smashed it. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion about the artistic merits of doing something like that, and my first reaction was probably the same as anyone else's, which was that that was a very terrible thing to do. Why would you destroy history like that? Well, he did that to bring attention to what the Chinese Communist Party had been doing for years on a massive scale. The Chinese Communist Party wanted to break something called the Mandate of Heaven, a historical perspective on the legitimacy of Chinese rulers, that as long as things were going well, they were legitimate and could be seen to legitimately govern the country. Well, they wanted to make a new world, not limited by the artifacts and practices of the past. And in order to do that, they saw fit to destroy any reminder of that past, to eradicate the old world so that it would no longer haunt them, so that their new world would be created completely separate and completely independently of the past that they turned away from and destroyed. Now, who's to say how well that's going? A more controversial example, and a far more recent one, and as a person who loves history, especially the history of Rome, the destruction of places like Palmyra by the Islamic State are very new, very recent, and very real examples of this same thing. They're destroying the old world in order to build a new world without that baggage. And while we just made arguments for nomadic societies maybe not being better or worse but different, and in fact some people have made arguments that it is in fact better in several ways. For instance, people will say that the Mongols managed to make trade routes run fantastically. You'll notice our trade routes fear no raids. Our trade routes run amazingly from corner to corner of the empire, with nothing getting in the way in the slightest. Some people will even say, just to slightly quote out of context John Green from his Crash Course World History about the Mongols, is that pastoral people tend to be more egalitarian, especially where women are concerned. Paradoxically, when there is less to go around, humans tend to share more. And when both men and women must work for the social order in order to survive, there tends to be less patriarchal domination of women. That could very well be true. They could very well manage trade, manage religion, manage equality better than we do in our society. You could argue, and many have, that they tend to be more egalitarian with their sharing of wealth. That really, though, I don't think that that's a legitimate argument. They also say that they were more religiously accommodating, more culturally ready to allow people of different cultures into their state, so long as they took the forms that they recognized, as long as they would basically kowtow to the Khan. Ultimately, though, I think we tend to overvalue that. I think that we look at societies which value different things, and we see how they don't establish the same... Essentially, they don't establish the same ways of showing status that we do, because they don't value the same things that we do. There are still ranks in nomadic society. The Khan is still the Khan. The sub-clans are still the sub-clans, loyal to the Khan, with their people loyal to them. And there is definitely a social hierarchy, just maybe one that we don't recognize as easily. While they may share material wealth more freely, they also value it less. And things that we may value less, they may value more highly, and create different levels of privilege based on their actual values. To idealize them is to ignore the complexity and nuance of their civilization. To point to them as some glowing city on a hill is to ignore their actual treatment of civilizations they conquered, to ignore essentially the genocide they had to commit to get their position of power, to get that wealth, to spread their understanding of the world to so many people. We argue that they may have improved in ways that we haven't, and that could be entirely correct. But we can't lose the price. And maybe there would be more equality if nomads ruled the world. But you've seen the last several episodes, you've seen the cost of overthrowing one world and establishing a new one. And maybe it would be better in 1,000 years, but it certainly wasn't better in the last 100, at least not for all of the cultures which no longer exist. To quote Dan Carlin, or really just to paraphrase Dan Carlin, of course we're going to think it's worth it. We didn't have to pay the bill. And that really sums it up. If we're not the ones paying for these changes, then who are we to say that they're worth it? Who are we to say that this is necessarily better? Honestly, I don't know exactly where to stand on that issue. We've went ahead, we've pillaged this whole world, we've created a new and better world for the people in charge. And that's really what civilizations do. Anyway, that was a bit heavy, and I'm sorry for that. However, at any rate, you can't really pillage an entire world without bringing up a little bit of maybe some ethical nuance to the argument, so you just don't look as terrible. To give a brief history of what we've done, we did start off in the very corner as a very minor group. We took over our settled neighbors to the south, pillaging their lands for the technology, manpower, and gold that we needed to conquer our nomadic neighbors. Once we've secured our power base, we moved into the Abbasid Empire, which was roughly the Persian Empire as well as the Arabian empires. We fought a few decisive battles at the very periphery of their empire with the subjugation casus belli. And what that means is, once we got 100% war score, which happened really quickly, in fact absurdly quickly you might say, we just seized control over their empire outright. A few short years later, we declared war on the Byzantines and incorporated their empire into our own. Ever after that, there was no real legitimate challenge from other states. all of our issues were domestic and internal from that point on. The main concern that we faced was, in a lot of ways, the succession. Twice in our history we had our Khagan die without an adult heir. Both of those times we lost control of the Khaganite, as you need to be an adult in order to rule, so a different clan would rise up and take over. The first time that happened, the new Khan, once our heir turned 16 luckily, decided he would become a settled civilization. He would lead a settled civilization as an emperor. And in doing so, he had to pass on the title of Khan, and he passed it on, quite thankfully, to one of our descendants. Now, a little bit down the road, we also ended up losing control of the Khaganite. However, once again, the old Khagan decided to settle down. It passed, but not directly to us. Once we turned 16, though, we were able to just ask for the Khaganite back, and the Khan, who was weak and in a bad position, having just inherited a rather unstable realm, gave it over to us. To thank him, we ended up executing him, as he had a very low relation of our new Khan for being kicked out of power. But besides that, we held control essentially just throughout our history. We never really had to fear any sort of uprising or domestic unrest. Our armies were just massive and plentiful, and every time a revolt did break out, we were able to easily crush it with our just superiority of force. Even as we pillaged the entire world from province to province, when revolts did break out, we had the wealth and manpower and technological advantage, we cannot forget that when rebellions broke out on the provinces we were turning into pasture, our armies destroyed those rebellions with such swiftness that they may have not even occurred at all. Although, don't get me wrong, they occurred almost monthly as people rose up to their cities being destroyed and their civilizations ended. It just didn't have any noticeable effect on the rate of progress. The only thing that really slowed us down was, quite frankly, the tedium of having to click the special holdings button, click pillage, and then pillage each and every individual holding several times over. All told, it took around 36 hours to pillage the entire world in real time. Could we say that that is the biggest limiting factor? Well, yes, it really was. Should it have been, though? I would argue no. I think something like this, for one, I would really prefer it if in the future it's made less tedious, but I also think there should be more internal challenges, more limiting factors other than just tedium that would make something like this impossible, as it was impossible in the real world, or at the very least just not a recommended course of action. At any rate, I didn't even enter this campaign hoping to do this. I entered this campaign wanting to see how quickly we could take over the world. I had heard that nomads were slightly overpowered, and I decided I wanted to test that. I started this campaign essentially the day that Horselords came out, and it's just taken me this long to get it to this point. Now that we are the only thing left in the world, it's quite possible that we could just continue it on like a normal Crusader Kings game. I mean, here we are, we have our title, we have our lands. It is ultimately a game about role-playing, at least to a large extent. We could still do that. And, in fact, so that everyone can do that if they would so like, I will upload this save, and from here on out, everyone can take the world in whichever direction they want to take it. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. There may be another video. Maybe we'll take this series to 1453 and see just what happens to our eternal Khaganite in the next 100 years, now that there really isn't any inherent direction for us to go. We're at the end of history, but it's not the end of the world.